it cost over $2 billion in 1945. That is more than $30 billion today. Over 600,000 people worked on it. Most of them had no idea what they were building. They knew it was important, they knew it was for the war, but the final product was a secret kept by a very small number of people. It was called the Manhattan Project. The project was born out of a letter, or a letter written by physicist Leo Szilard and signed by Albert Einstein in 1939. It warned the American president about the possibility of a new powerful kind of weapon. The race was on. What followed was the single largest scientific and industrial effort in human history. It created secret cities, it pushed the boundaries of physics, chemistry, and engineering, and it ended with 2 explosions that changed the world forever. But what if the device itself was not the project's most lasting legacy? What if the real changes were the ones that came after? The ones that crept into our hospitals, our power grids, our computers, and our very way of thinking about science and government, designed to create an ultimate weapon, end up giving us cancer treatments and clean energy. How did it invent the way modern science is done? And what secrets from that time are still buried, waiting to be understood? The story of the Manhattan Project did not end in 1945. In many ways, it was just beginning. Number 19, did it force science to have a conscience? Before the Manhattan Project, science was often seen as a pure pursuit of knowledge. Scientists worked in labs. They published papers. Their work was mostly academic. It rarely forced them to confront life and death decisions on a global scale. The project changed that. It took theoretical physics and turned it into a weapon of mass destruction. Well, suddenly the people who worked with chalkboards and equations had to think about the real-world consequences of their work. Well, J. Robert Oppenheimer, the scientific director at Los Alamos, became the face of this struggle. He was a brilliant theoretical physicist. He loved poetry and philosophy, but he was tasked with leading the team to build the device. After the first successful test in the New Mexico desert on July 16, 1945, he famously recalled a line from the Hindu scripture, the Bhagavad Gita, "Now I am become death, the destroyer of worlds." This was not the triumphant cry of a conqueror. It was the haunted reflection of a man who understood what he had unleashed. His later life was defined by his advocacy for international control of nuclear energy and his opposition to the development of even more powerful weapons. The 1954 security hearing that stripped him of his clearance was, in part, a result of his moral and political stances that grew directly from his work on the project. He was not alone. Leo Szilard, the physicist who had initiated the project with his letter, became one of its most vocal critics. Once he realized the weapon was going to be built, he tried to stop it from being used. In the spring of 1945, he organized a Szilard petition signed by 70 other scientists from the project. It urged the president not to use the weapon against civilian populations without a clear warning and a chance for surrender. The petition never made it to the president's desk. It was stopped by General Leslie Groves, the military head of the project, who saw it as a security risk. This internal conflict created a new kind of scientist, the scientist activist. After the war, many Manhattan Project veterans founded organizations to deal with the new reality they had created. The Federation of American Scientists was formed in 1945 by project scientists who felt they had a moral obligation to inform the public and politicians about the dangers of nuclear weapons. The first issue of the Bulletin of the Atomic Scientists, published in December 1945, featured articles by Oppenheimer and other project alumni. Its famous doomsday clock, first appearing in 1947, became a universal symbol of nuclear risk. These were not just academic journals. They were political and moral statements. Science could no longer pretend to be separate from society. The project had tied them together permanently. What do we still not know? How many scientists on the project secretly harbored deep moral objections but remained silent for fear of reprisal? Were there organized efforts to sabotage or slow down the research from within that we have yet to uncover? And in our modern age of AI and genetic engineering, have we truly learned the lessons about scientific responsibility that the first atomic scientists tried to teach us? Number 18, how did it create a new kind of secrecy? The need for secrecy in wartime is obvious, but the Manhattan Project took it to a different level. It created a culture of classification and compartmentalization that became the blueprint for the modern national security state. The project was so secret that the Vice President Harry Truman did not know about it until he became president in April 1945. Many governors did not know that massive secret cities were being built in their states. The principle that governed the project was called compartmentalization. It was General Groves' idea. The theory was simple. You only know what you need to know to do your job. It's nothing more. A chemist at Oak Ridge enriching uranium did not know what the physicists at Los Alamos were doing with it. A construction worker at the Hanford site in Washington State building giant reactors might be told he was working on a new kind of engine. Most of the 600,000 people involved had no idea of the project's true purpose. This prevented leaks. It also created a strange paranoid environment. Mail was censored, conversations were monitored, people were followed. The FBI maintained extensive files on top scientists like Oppenheimer, looking for any sign of disloyalty. This system of secrecy did not disappear after the war. It became institutionalized. The Atomic Energy Act of 1946 created the Atomic Energy Commission, AEC, a civilian agency that took control of the nation's nuclear program. The act established a new category of secret information, restricted data. This category was unique. It covered all information related to the design, manufacture, or use of atomic weapons. And under the law, this information was considered born secret. That meant it was classified from the moment of its creation, regardless of who created it or whether it had been officially marked as classified. This legal concept was a radical departure from traditional government secrecy. This culture spread. The Central Intelligence Agency was formed in 1947. The National Security Agency was created in 1952. The entire intelligence community grew out of this wartime model of deep secrecy and compartmentalization. The systems of security clearances, background checks, and classified information that are now standard in government and defense industries have their roots in the methods used to protect the secrets of the Manhattan Project. The idea that the government could operate a vast, expensive program completely hidden from public and even congressional oversight was tested and proven by the project. What secrets about the project are still classified today? More than 75 years later, how much did the intense culture of secrecy hinder scientific progress by preventing collaboration between different teams? And has the born secret doctrine created a permanent, unaccountable branch of government that operates outside of public view? Number 17, did it start the supercomputer revolution? Building the first atomic device was not just a materials problem, it was a math problem. The physics involved were incredibly complex. The scientists needed to calculate the behavior of neutrons in a chain reaction. They had to figure out the hydrodynamics of a massive implosion. These calculations were far too large and tedious to be done by hand. The teams at Los Alamos turned to machines. At the time, the most powerful computing tools were IBM punch card machines. They were essentially mechanical calculators clattering away as they processed stacks of cards. Richard Feynman, a young physicist who would later win a Nobel Prize, was put in charge of the computing group at Los Alamos. He and his team became experts at programming these machines, wiring up panels to make them perform sequences of calculations. They even ran multiple machines in parallel to solve a single problem, a precursor to modern parallel computing. But even these were not enough. They were too slow. The need for faster calculations pushed scientists to think about electronic computers. John von Neumann, a brilliant mathematician and a consultant for the project, became deeply involved in this problem. While working at Los Alamos, he learned about the development of the ENIAC, the first general-purpose electronic computer, being built at the University of Pennsylvania. And von Neumann's work on the physics of implosion for the plutonium device convinced him of the need for an even more powerful machine. After the war, he designed the von Neumann architecture, the fundamental structure of nearly every computer built since, with a central processing unit, a memory unit, and input-output devices. His first machine, based on this design, the MANIAC mathematical analyzer, numerator, integrator, and computer, was built at Los Alamos. Its first major task was to perform the complex calculations needed for the development of the hydrogen bomb. The national labs that grew out of the Manhattan Project, Los Alamos, Lawrence, Livermore, and later others, became the primary drivers of supercomputing for decades. The need to simulate nuclear reactions without physical testing, especially after the test ban treaties, meant they always needed the fastest computers in the world. On companies like Cray Research, founded by Seymour Cray, worked closely with the labs to build next-generation supercomputers. The complex simulations developed for weapons design were adapted for other fields. Today, supercomputers are used for climate modeling, drug discovery, galaxy formation simulations, and artificial intelligence research. The entire field of computational science, using massive computing power to solve complex problems, owes its existence to the urgent mathematical needs of the Manhattan Project. What early computing breakthroughs made for the project were kept secret and never commercialized. How much faster would consumer computing have developed if the National Lab's innovations had not been classified for decades? Could the internet itself have evolved differently without the early computer networks developed to link these research centers? Number 16, did it create entirely new elements? The periodic table seems like a fixed, fundamental chart of the universe, but the Manhattan Project literally added to it. The core of the project was about manipulating the elements, specifically uranium, but in the process, they created elements that had never been seen on Earth before. The most famous of these is plutonium. In 1940, a team at the University of California, Berkeley, led by Glenn T. Seaborg and Edwin McMillan, bombarded uranium with deuterons in a particle accelerator. They created neptunium element 93. Shortly after, they discovered that neptunium decayed into a new, more stable element, plutonium element 94. When they realized that a specific isotope, plutonium-239, could sustain a chain reaction even more easily than uranium-235, it became central to the Manhattan Project. The massive reactors at Hanford, Washington, were built for one purpose: to bombard uranium-238 with neutrons to produce plutonium-239. The device tested at Trinity and the one used over Nagasaki were plutonium-based. Seaborg's work was so crucial and so secret that he was asked to move to the project's metallurgical lab in Chicago in the middle of the night. He would later win a Nobel Prize in Chemistry in 1951 for his discoveries, but the creation of new elements did not stop there. The intense neutron flux inside the first hydrogen bomb test, codenamed Ivy Mike, in 1952, created conditions not seen since the explosion of a supernova. When scientists analyzed the fallout from the test, they discovered two new highly radioactive elements in the debris. They were named Einsteinium element 99 and fermium element 100, in honor of Albert Einstein and Enrico Fermi, two of the intellectual fathers of the atomic age. This work laid the foundation for the synthesis of all subsequent transuranic elements. The techniques of bombarding heavy elements with particles and accelerators, pioneered by Seaborg and his team, are still used today by scientists at labs around the world to create heavier and heavier elements, like oganesson element 118. The national laboratories born from the Manhattan Project, like Lawrence Berkeley National Laboratory, remained at the forefront of this research for decades. The project showed that the periodic table was not a finished map. It was a territory that could be explored and expanded. What other short-lived, exotic elements were created in the early atomic tests but decayed before they could be detected or identified? Are there undiscovered islands of stability in the periodic table where super heavy elements might exist for more than a few milliseconds? And did the project's secret research into element creation uncover any physical properties that still remain classified? Number 15, how did it change the American West? Before World War II, the American West was often seen as a vast, empty landscape. It was a place of natural beauty, national parks, and sparse populations. The Manhattan Project changed that perception. It saw the West not as empty, but as ideal. It had space. It had isolation. It had access to water and power. The government moved in and transformed huge swaths of the landscape into top-secret industrial and scientific complexes. Los Alamos, New Mexico, is the most famous example. In 1942, it was a remote ranch school for boys. Oppenheimer, who loved the region, suggested it as the site for the main weapon design laboratory. The U.S. Army bought the land. Within 2 years, a secret city of over 6,000 scientists, technicians, and their families appeared on the isolated mesa. They built labs, workshops, and houses, all behind a fence hidden from the world. The scale of the transformation was even greater at Hanford, in eastern Washington state. The government took over 586 square miles of land along the Columbia River, displacing farmers and Native American tribes. They built 3 massive nuclear reactors and several chemical processing plants to produce plutonium. It became a sprawling industrial zone in the middle of the desert, employing nearly 50,000 people at its peak. The Grand Coulee Dam, built just a few years earlier, provided the enormous amounts of electricity needed to run the site. This influx of federal money, infrastructure, and highly educated people had a lasting impact. It helped kickstart the economic and population boom that transformed the West in the post-war era. The national labs like Los Alamos and later Sandia in New Mexico and Lawrence Livermore in California became permanent centers of scientific research and major employers. They attracted other high-tech industries. The region became a key part of the military-industrial complex. Cities like Albuquerque, Denver, and Salt Lake City grew rapidly as they became hubs for defense and technology companies. The project effectively militarized and industrialized large parts of the American West, turning its open spaces into a crucial asset for national security. What was the full extent of the environmental damage done to these western lands, much of which remained secret for decades? How did the sudden arrival of these massive secret projects permanently alter the cultures of the local and Native American communities they displaced? And are there still secret government installations hidden in the vast expanses of the West that trace their origins back to the Manhattan Project? Number 14, did it give us nuclear power? The first goal of the Manhattan Project was to create a chain reaction. The second was to turn that reaction into a weapon. But some of the scientists involved immediately saw another possibility. A controlled chain reaction could generate an enormous amount of heat. That heat could be used to boil water, create steam, and turn a turbine to generate electricity. This was the basic idea behind nuclear power. The very first nuclear reactor, Chicago Pile 1, CP1, was built under the stands of a squash court at the University of Chicago. On December 2nd, 1942, a team led by Enrico Fermi achieved the first self-sustaining nuclear chain reaction. The reactor was a simple pile of graphite blocks and uranium slugs. It produced only half a watt of power, barely enough to light a small light bulb. It was a proof of concept, not a power plant. But it proved that the process could be controlled. The massive reactors built at Hanford were not designed for power generation. Their purpose was to produce plutonium. They were cooled by water from the Columbia River, and all the heat they generated was simply vented as waste. But the experience of designing, building, and operating these large reactors provided the essential engineering knowledge for future power reactors. Scientists and engineers learned how to control reactions, how to shield against radiation, and how to handle nuclear fuel. After the war, this knowledge was put to civilian use. Under President Eisenhower's Atoms for Peace program, the focus shifted to developing nuclear energy for electricity. Hyman Rickover, then a captain in the U.S. Navy, used the project's reactor technology to build the first nuclear-powered submarine, the USS Nautilus. This compact pressurized water reactor, PWR, became the model for most commercial nuclear power plants in the world. The first commercial nuclear power plant in the United States opened in Shippingport, Pennsylvania in 1957. It was built by the Atomic Energy Commission and was a direct descendant of the project's research. For a time, nuclear power was hailed as the energy of the future, clean, cheap, and too abundant to meter. While events like 3 Mile Island and Chernobyl would later temper that optimism, the global nuclear power industry today is a direct legacy of the physics and engineering developed in secret between 1942 and 1945. Did the project's intense focus on weapons-grade materials delay the development of safer, more efficient reactor designs like thorium reactors? How much of the early civilian nuclear power program was actually a cover for producing more plutonium for the military? And could a viable nuclear power industry have ever been created without the massive initial government investment of the Manhattan Project? Number 13, how did it invent big science? Before the Manhattan Project, science was usually done on a small scale. A professor, a few graduate students, a university lab. Funding came from universities or private foundations. The Manhattan Project changed the entire model. It introduced the concept of big science, massive government-funded, mission-oriented research projects involving thousands of people from different fields working together in large, centralized facilities. The sheer scale was unprecedented. It was managed by the military General Groves, but directed by a civilian scientist, Oppenheimer. It brought together physicists, chemists, metallurgists, engineers, and mathematicians. It created entire cities dedicated to a single scientific goal. At its peak, Oak Ridge in Tennessee had a population of 75,000. These were not just labs, they were industrial scale operation. The K-25 gaseous diffusion plant at Oak Ridge, built to enrich uranium, was the largest building in the world at the time. This new model proved to be incredibly effective. It solved immense scientific and engineering challenges in a remarkably short time. After the war, this model was copied. The government, seeing the success of the project, continued to pour money into large-scale research. The Atomic Energy Commission was just the first of many new agencies. The National Science Foundation, NSF, was established in 1950 based on a report by Vannevar Bush, the head of the Wartime Office of Scientific Research and Development. NASA, founded in 1958, used the Big Science model to put a man on the moon. The Human Genome Project, which mapped our entire DNA, was another example. Today, major scientific endeavors like the Large Hadron Collider at CERN in Switzerland are direct descendants of this approach. They are international collaborations costing billions of dollars, involving thousands of scientists, all focused on a single, ambitious goal. The National Laboratory System in the United States, Los Alamos, Oak Ridge, Argonne, Berkeley, and others, is the most direct institutional legacy. These labs were born from the project and remain at the forefront of American scientific research, tackling everything from climate change to materials science to national security. The idea of science as a national strategic asset worthy of massive public investment comes directly from the success of the Manhattan Project. Does the Big Science model, with its huge budgets and top-down management, stifle the kind of individual creativity that leads to true breakthroughs? Has science become too dependent on government funding, making it vulnerable to political agendas? And what happens to a field of science when the big project it was built around is completed or canceled? Number 12, did it create the National Laboratory System? Where does science happen? Before the war, the answer was almost always a university. The Manhattan Project created a new answer, a national laboratory. These were entirely new kinds of institutions, neither academic nor purely industrial, owned by the government, but often managed by universities or private companies. They were created to solve a specific national problem, and they did not disappear when the problem was solved. The first three were Los Alamos, Oak Ridge, and Argonne. Los Alamos was the weapons design lab built on an isolated mesa in New Mexico. After the war, it became Los Alamos National Laboratory, continuing its work on national security, but also branching out into a huge range of basic and applied science, from supercomputing to public health. The University of California managed it for decades. Oak Ridge in Tennessee was home to the massive uranium enrichment facilities. After the war, it became Oak Ridge National Laboratory Ornal. It transitioned from isotope separation to research in nuclear energy, material science, and neutron science. Today, it houses some of the world's most powerful supercomputers and the Spallation Neutron Source, a major international research facility. The Metallurgical Laboratory at the University of Chicago, where Fermi built his first reactor, was formalized and moved to a new site outside the city. It became Argonne National Laboratory in 1946. Its initial mission was to develop nuclear reactors for peaceful purposes. It has since become a multidisciplinary science and engineering research center, working on everything from advanced batteries to particle physics. This model was so successful that it was expanded. Lawrence Berkeley National Laboratory grew out of Ernest Lawrence's cyclotron lab. Sandia National Laboratories was created in Albuquerque to handle the engineering and production of nuclear weapons. Brookhaven National Laboratory was established on Long Island, New York, for peaceful atomic research. This network of 17 national labs, overseen by the Department of Energy, the successor to the AEC, is the heart of America's scientific research infrastructure. They possess unique facilities, particle accelerators, nuclear reactors, supercomputers that are too large and expensive for any single university or company to build. They are a permanent legacy of the project's need for centralized, mission-driven research centers. What happens when a national lab's original mission becomes obsolete? Can these massive bureaucratic institutions adapt quickly to new scientific challenges? And is there a risk that the lab's close ties to the government and national security priorities skew the direction of American scientific research? Number 11, how did it forge the military-industrial complex? The Manhattan Project was not just a government program, it was a partnership between the government, the military, universities, and private industry on a scale never seen before. This three-way collaboration became the model for what President Eisenhower would later call the military-industrial complex. General Groves was the military manager. The scientists came from universities like Columbia, Chicago, and Berkeley. But to actually build the massive facilities and equipment required, the project turned to America's biggest corporations. DuPont, a chemical company, was given the contract to design, build, and operate the entire Hanford plutonium production site, a $1 billion job. And Union Carbide, another chemical giant, ran the vast uranium enrichment plants at Oak Ridge. Companies like Allis-Chalmers, Westinghouse, and General Electric were brought in to build specialized components like the massive magnets for the calytrons used in uranium separation. These were not typical contracts. The companies were often working on technologies that had never been tried before, with immense secrecy and tight deadlines. They were paid on a cost-plus basis, meaning the government covered their costs and guaranteed them a fixed profit. This removed the financial risk of taking on such an uncertain and monumental task. This contracting model became the standard for defense procurement for decades to come. This created a powerful self-reinforcing relationship. The military needed advanced technology. The corporations had the industrial capacity to build it. The universities provided the basic research and the brainpower. After the war, this triangle became a permanent feature of the American economy. The defense budget soared. Companies that had built reactors and processing plants for the project became major defense contractors, building missiles, submarines, and aircraft. Universities continued to receive massive research grants from the Department of Defense and the Atomic Energy Commission. A permanent arms industry, deeply intertwined with government policy and scientific research, was born. Eisenhower, in his 1961 farewell address, warned that the nation must guard against the acquisition of unwarranted influence by the military-industrial complex. That complex was forged in the secret cities and factories of the Manhattan Project. To what extent does this complex now drive policy, creating a demand for new weapon systems to keep the production lines running? How much scientific talent is drawn away from other pressing problems, like climate change and disease, by the high salaries and advanced resources of the defense industry? And is it possible for a country to maintain a leading-edge military without this kind of deep, permanent fusion of industry, science, and government? Number 10, did it map the human body from the inside? One of the project's most surprising legacies is in medicine. The scientists working on the project were intensely aware of the dangers of radiation. They had to develop new ways to detect it, to measure it, and to understand its effects on the human body. This urgent need led to the birth of the field of health physics and laid the groundwork for modern nuclear medicine. To protect the thousands of workers at Oak Ridge, Hanford, and Los Alamos, the project created a health division. They developed new instruments like the Geiger counter for monitoring radiation levels. They established the first large-scale radiation safety programs with strict rules about handling radioactive materials and mandatory health checkups. They studied the effects of radiation on animals to try to understand the risks. The project also created a huge supply of new radioactive isotopes. The nuclear reactors built to produce plutonium were essentially isotope factories. They could create radioactive versions of common elements like iodine 131, phosphorus 32, and carbon-14. After the war, the Atomic Energy Commission began shipping these radioisotopes to hospitals and researchers around the country at very low cost. This was the start of nuclear medicine. Doctors realized they could use these isotopes as tracers. A patient could ingest a small, safe amount of a radioactive substance. The substance would travel to a specific organ in the body. For example, radioactive iodine naturally accumulates in the thyroid gland. A special camera could then track the radiation from outside the body, creating a map of the organ and showing how well it was functioning. This was the basis for technologies like the PET scan positron emission tomography and SPECT scan single photon emission computed tomography, which are now common diagnostic tools for cancer, heart disease, and brain disorders. The same isotopes could also be used for therapy. A large dose of iodine 131 could be used to destroy cancerous cells in the thyroid gland, a targeted form of radiation therapy that is still used today. The project's work on particle accelerators, like the cyclotrons at Berkeley, also led to new forms of cancer treatment using beams of protons or other particles to destroy tumors with great precision. The entire field of using radiation to see inside the human body and to treat its diseases grew directly from the safety and production work of the Manhattan Project. What were the long-term health consequences for the project's own workers, some of whom were exposed to unknown levels of radiation? Did the project conduct secret medical experiments on human subjects to understand radiation's effects, as some historical accounts suggest? And are we fully aware of the cumulative risks of the low-dose radiation we receive from the millions of medical scans performed every year? Number 9. How did it start a global arms race? The stated goal of the Manhattan Project was to develop the weapon before a rival power could, but in achieving that goal, it created a new kind of global instability. The moment the United States demonstrated its atomic capability, it was inevitable that other nations would try to acquire it. The project did not end the race for the ultimate weapon, it just fired the starting gun. The main rival was the Soviet Union. Soviet intelligence had successfully infiltrated the Manhattan Project. Scientists like Klaus Fuchs, a German-born physicist who worked at Los Alamos, passed crucial scientific secrets to Moscow. These secrets, combined with the efforts of their own brilliant scientists, allowed the Soviets to develop their own atomic device much faster than American experts had predicted. They successfully tested their first device on August 29, 1949. This event shocked the American government and public. It ended the U.S. nuclear monopoly and began the Cold War in earnest. The response was not to seek control, but to seek superiority. President Truman authorized the development of a far more powerful weapon, the hydrogen bomb, or the super. Many of the original Manhattan Project scientists, including Oppenheimer, opposed this, arguing it would only escalate the arms race. But others, like Edward Teller and Ernest Lawrence, pushed for it. The first U.S. hydrogen device was tested in 1952. The Soviets tested theirs less than a year later. The race was on. Both sides began to build up massive arsenals of nuclear weapons, delivering them with long-range bombers, submarines, and intercontinental ballistic missiles (ICBMs). The United Kingdom, France, and China developed their own nuclear weapons. The world entered a new era defined by the concept of mutually assured destruction mad, the idea that a nuclear war was unwinnable because both sides would be completely destroyed. For the next 40 years, humanity lived with the constant background fear of nuclear annihilation. This entire geopolitical landscape, a world divided into nuclear haves and have-nots, was a direct and immediate consequence of the success of the Manhattan Project. How close did the world actually come to nuclear war during crises like the one in Cuba? Were there other less-known instances of near misses or accidents that remain classified? And is the current system of nuclear deterrence truly stable? Or is it just a matter of time before the weapons created by the project are used again? Number 8. Did it change our relationship with the planet? The Manhattan Project left scars on the landscape. Not just the visible ones from the test in New Mexico, but invisible scars of radioactive contamination that we are still trying to clean up today. The immense industrial effort to produce uranium and plutonium was done quickly, with wartime urgency. Environmental safety was a secondary concern. The result was a legacy of pollution that created a new field of science, environmental remediation. The Hanford site in Washington is perhaps the most heavily contaminated place in the Western Hemisphere. For decades, the reactors and processing plants there generated enormous amounts of radioactive and chemical waste. Millions of gallons of high-level liquid radioactive waste were stored in large underground tanks, many of which have since leaked. Solid waste was buried in unlined trenches, contaminated water was discharged into the soil. The cleanup of Hanford is now the largest environmental remediation project in the world. It began in 1989, is projected to take many more decades, and has already cost over $100 billion. The final cost is unknown. Oak Ridge and Los Alamos have their own smaller-scale contamination problems. And the project's impact was not limited to the main sites. Uranium was mined and processed on Navajo land in the Four Corners region, leaving a legacy of contaminated water, soil, and lung cancer among the miners, a tragedy documented in books like If You Poison Us by Peter H. Eichstadt. This experience, repeated at nuclear production sites around the world, fundamentally changed our understanding of pollution. And it introduced the concept of contaminants that do not biodegrade, that remain dangerous for thousands of years. Forced scientists to develop new techniques for tracking how pollutants move through groundwater and ecosystems. It led to the creation of the Environmental Protection Agency EPA in 1970 and the passage of major environmental laws like the Superfund Act, designed to clean up the nation's most contaminated sites. The modern environmental movement, while focused on many issues, has its roots in the atomic age and the fear of invisible, long-lasting poisons unleashed by the project and its successors. What is the true full cost of cleaning up the entire nuclear weapons complex in the U.S.? Are there contaminated sites from the early days of the project that we still don't know about? And how can we possibly guarantee the safety of nuclear waste repositories for the 10,000 years or more? They need to be isolated from the environment. Number 7, how did it define the role of scientists in government? Before the war, scientists were rarely seen in the halls of power. They were academics, not policy advisors. The Manhattan Project changed that. It demonstrated that science and technology were not just subjects of academic interest, but were central to national power and security. Scientists became essential advisors to presidents and generals. Vannevar Bush was the prototype of this new role. As the director of the Office of Scientific Research and Development, he was the primary organizer of the American scientific effort during the war, including the Manhattan Project. He was a master of navigating the worlds of science, industry, and politics. His 1945 report, Science, the Endless Frontier, argued that the federal government had a responsibility to support basic scientific research, even in peacetime. This report led directly to the creation of the National Science Foundation and established the basic framework for federal science funding that persists to this day. After the war, the President's Science Advisory Committee, SAC, was established, placing a group of elite scientists directly in the White House to advise the president on technical issues, from arms control to space exploration. And Manhattan Project veterans were prominent in these roles for years. The debate over the hydrogen bomb was a key moment. It showed that scientists could be powerful political advocates, with Oppenheimer and Teller leading opposing factions, each using their scientific authority to try and influence national policy. This created a complicated and sometimes fraught relationship. Scientists brought technical expertise to government, but they also brought their own political and moral views. The Oppenheimer security hearing in 1954 was a brutal example of what could happen when a scientist's advice conflicted with the prevailing political winds. He was punished not for any act of disloyalty, but for his opinions and associations. The case had a chilling effect, making some scientists wary of government service. Still, the precedent was set. From that point on, no major policy decision involving technology, whether it's about climate change, cybersecurity, or a pandemic, is made without scientists in the room. This role of scientist as trusted and sometimes controversial government insider is a direct legacy of the project. Do scientists today have the same level of influence in government that they did in the decades following the project? Has the increasing politicization of science eroded the public's trust in scientific advice? And can a scientist give purely objective advice, or are their recommendations always shaped by their personal values? Number 6, did it make us all alive in the atomic age? The end of the war did not just bring peace. It brought a new, strange culture of anxiety and optimism, all centered on the atom. The secrecy of the project was suddenly broken, and the public was confronted with a new world-changing force they did not understand. This kicked off the atomic age, a period where nuclear themes permeated every aspect of popular culture. There was immense fear. The images of the mushroom clouds became iconic symbols of destruction. Schools began to practice duck and cover drills, teaching children to hide under their desks in case of a nuclear attack. People built fallout shelters in their backyards. A whole genre of post-apocalyptic fiction emerged with movies like On the Beach, 1959, and books like A Canticle for Leibowitz, 1959, imagining a world devastated by nuclear war. The monster movies of the 1950s, like Godzilla and them, often featured creatures created or awakened by atomic testing. But there was also a wild, almost utopian optimism. The atom promised a future of limitless, clean energy. The Atoms for Peace program promoted the idea of using nuclear science for good. Futurists imagined nuclear-powered cars, airplanes, and even cities. The atomic motif appeared in design and architecture. The iconic Googie architectural style, with its starbursts and swooping forms, was inspired by atomic imagery. There was the atomic cocktail, and companies used the word atomic to market everything from toys to laundry detergent, implying power and modernity. This duality, the promise of a perfect future, and the threat of total annihilation defined the culture of the Cold War. It created a kind of background hum of anxiety that affected a whole generation. The project did not just create a new weapon, it created a new psychological landscape. It gave humanity the power to destroy itself, and we have been living with the cultural and psychological consequences of that knowledge ever since. How did the constant, low-level fear of nuclear war during the Cold War shape the psychology of the generations who grew up with it? Atoms for Peace propaganda intentionally downplay the real, long-term dangers of nuclear technology. And in our current age, has our cultural memory of the atomic threat faded to a dangerous degree? Number 5, did it launch the space race? The connection might not seem direct, but the Manhattan Project provided the technological and political foundation for the American space program. The link is through rocketry. While the first atomic devices were delivered by airplanes, it was immediately clear that the future of nuclear delivery was the long-range ballistic missile. The science of rocketry had been developed largely in Germany before and during the war. After the war ended, both the United States and the Soviet Union scrambled to capture German rocket scientists and their technology. The U.S. effort, called Operation Paperclip, brought Wernher von Braun and his team of V-2 rocket engineers to America. They were put to work developing ballistic missiles for the U.S. Army. The purpose of these new powerful rockets was to carry nuclear warheads. The Atlas and Titan ICBMs, developed in the 1950s, were designed as delivery systems for the hydrogen bombs that were a direct outgrowth of the Manhattan Project's work. The space race began in earnest on October 4th, 1957, when the Soviet Union used one of its own ICBMs to launch Sputnik, the first artificial satellite. The American public was shocked that the Soviets had beaten them into space. The fear was not just about scientific prestige, it was about national security. A rocket that could put a satellite into orbit could also deliver a nuclear warhead to any city in America. The American response was swift. NASA was created in 1958. The education system was revamped with the National Defense Education Act to produce more scientists and engineers. And the same rockets that were developed to carry weapons were repurposed for space exploration. The Redstone rocket, which launched America's first astronaut, Alan Shepard, was a direct descendant of the V-2 and was designed as a short-range nuclear missile. The massive Saturn V rocket that took astronauts to the moon was designed by Wernher von Braun's team, the same people who had built weapons of war. The entire Apollo program was driven by the Cold War competition that the Manhattan Project had unleashed. The desire to demonstrate technological superiority in space was a direct consequence of the nuclear arms race on Earth. Without the intense pressure of the nuclear arms race, would humanity have ever devoted the resources to go to the moon? How many of the technologies we now take for granted, from GPS to satellite communication, are direct byproducts of this military competition? And did the focus on large, expensive rockets for weapons delivery crowd out other, potentially more efficient approaches to space exploration? Number 4, how did it build a nuclear navy? For centuries, the range of a naval ship was limited by how much fuel it could carry. A ship had to be refueled every few thousand miles, tying it to a network of bases and tankers. The Manhattan Project offered a way to break that chain. A reactor powered by a small amount of uranium could run a ship for years without refueling. This idea created the modern nuclear navy. The driving force behind this revolution was Admiral Hyman G. Rickover. He was an engineering officer assigned to Oak Ridge in 1946 to study nuclear technology. He immediately saw the potential for nuclear-powered submarines. A nuclear submarine would not need to surface to run diesel engines to recharge its batteries. It would not need to take in air for combustion. It could stay submerged for months at a time, limited only by the food supply for the crew. It would be a true submersible, faster and stealthier than any submarine that came before it. Rickover was a brilliant and notoriously difficult man. He used his position within the Navy and the Atomic Energy Commission to push his vision forward with relentless determination. He oversaw the development of the pressurized water reactor, a compact and safe design adapted from the project's research. This reactor was installed in the world's first nuclear-powered vessel, the submarine USS Nautilus, which was launched in 1954. On its shakedown cruise, the Nautilus sent a famous message underway on nuclear power. In 1958, it traveled from the Pacific to the Atlantic by passing under the North Pole's ice cap, a feat impossible for any conventional submarine. The success of the Nautilus transformed naval warfare. The U.S. built a fleet of nuclear attack submarines. More importantly, they developed nuclear-powered ballistic missile submarines. These submarines could hide in the depths of the ocean for months, providing a secure second strike capability that became the cornerstone of America's nuclear deterrent. Later, the technology was adapted for aircraft carriers, giving them nearly unlimited range and the ability to operate for over 20 years without refueling. The modern American Navy, with its ability to project power anywhere in the world, is a direct legacy of the reactor technology developed by the Manhattan Project and weaponized by the vision of Hyman Rickover. What is the long-term environmental risk posed by the dozens of decommissioned nuclear submarines and their reactors that are now in storage? How vulnerable are modern naval forces to cyber attacks that could target their complex reactor control systems? And did the focus on expensive nuclear-powered vessels starve the Navy of resources needed for other types of ships and capabilities? Number 3, did it give us the tools to study our past? A surprising legacy of the Manhattan Project lies not in the future, but deep in the past. One of the isotopes that project scientists studied was carbon-14. It is a naturally occurring radioactive version of carbon. In 1940, Martin Kamen and Sam Rubin at the Berkeley Radiation Laboratory confirmed its existence and long half-life. But it was a chemist named Willard Libby who worked on the project's uranium enrichment program at Columbia University who realized its true potential. Libby understood that all living things, plants, animals, people, take in carbon from the atmosphere. A tiny fraction of that carbon is radioactive carbon-14. As long as an organism is alive, the ratio of carbon-14 to normal carbon-12 in its body is the same as the ratio in the atmosphere. But when the organism dies, it stops taking in new carbon. The carbon-14 it contains begins to decay at a predictable rate. It has a half-life of about 5,730 years. That means that after 5,730 years, half of the carbon-14 will be gone. After another 5,730 years, half of the remainder will be gone, and so on. Libby reasoned that by measuring the amount of carbon-14 left in an ancient piece of organic material like wood, bone, or cloth, he could calculate how long ago it had died. This was the principle of radiocarbon dating. After the war, he developed the technique at the University of Chicago. In 1949, he and his team proved it worked by accurately dating samples of wood from ancient Egyptian tombs, whose age was already known from historical records. The discovery was a revolution for archaeology, anthropology, and geology. Before radiocarbon dating, dating ancient artifacts was often a matter of educated guesswork. Suddenly, scientists had a clock that could accurately date objects up to 50,000 years old. It allowed them to create a reliable timeline for human history. They could determine the age of prehistoric settlements, track the spread of agriculture, and date the extinction of Ice Age animals. The technique has been used to date the Dead Sea Scrolls, the Shroud of Turin, and the cave paintings at Lascaux. For this discovery, a direct application of the nuclear physics central to the Manhattan Project, Willard Libby was awarded the Nobel Prize in Chemistry in 1960. Are there subtle environmental factors that might throw off the accuracy of radiocarbon dating in ways we don't yet understand? Could other longer-lived isotopes produced by the project be used to create new dating techniques for even older materials? And did the atmospheric nuclear testing of the 1950s and 60s, which doubled the amount of carbon-14 in the atmosphere, permanently contaminate the record for future archaeologists? Number 2, How did it redefine international relations? The world after 1945 was a fundamentally different place. For all of human history, international power had been measured in armies, navies, industrial capacity, and territory. The Manhattan Project added a new absolute variable to the equation: possession of the bomb. It created a new kind of world order. The first immediate effect was the creation of a bipolar world. Before the war, there were multiple great powers: Britain, France, Germany, Japan, the Soviet Union, the United States. After the war, there were only two superpowers. The US and the USSR were the only nations with the economic and industrial might to build and maintain large nuclear arsenals. The rest of the world was forced to align with one side or the other. This created the political and military blocs of the Cold War NATO and the Warsaw Pact. The existence of nuclear weapons also changed the nature of conflict. A direct war between the two superpowers was now unthinkable. It would lead to mutual annihilation, so conflict went underground. It took the form of proxy wars fought in places like Korea, Vietnam, and Afghanistan, where the superpowers backed opposing sides. It also took the form of espionage, propaganda, and technological competition like the space race. Diplomacy changed too. It became a high-stakes game of crisis management, as seen during the Cuban Missile Crisis, where the goal was to de-escalate conflicts before they reached the nuclear threshold. The project also gave rise to the concept of nuclear non-proliferation. The nations that had the bomb wanted to prevent others from getting it. This led to the Nuclear Non-Proliferation Treaty (NPT) of 1968, a landmark agreement where non-nuclear states agreed not to acquire weapons in exchange for access to peaceful nuclear technology. The International Atomic Energy Agency (IAEA) was created to inspect nuclear facilities and prevent the diversion of materials for weapons. This entire framework of treaties, inspections, and international agencies that governs nuclear technology today is a direct attempt to manage the world that the Manhattan Project created. Can the non-proliferation regime survive in a world with new technological challenges like 3D printing and advanced cyber attacks? Is it morally or politically sustainable for a small club of nations to possess these weapons while denying them to everyone else? And what happens to global stability if a non-state actor, like a terrorist group, acquires the materials to build a crude nuclear device? Number one, did it end one or only to start a colder one? This is perhaps the most debated legacy of all. The Manhattan Project was created for a single purpose: to end World War II. It achieved that goal. After the use of the atomic devices, the conflict that had engulfed the globe for 6 years came to an abrupt end. But in solving one massive problem, did it create an even larger, more enduring one? The moment the war ended, the alliance between the United States and the Soviet Union began to fracture. They had been allies of convenience against a common enemy, but their political and economic systems were fundamentally opposed. The possession of the atomic bomb by the US created a deep sense of insecurity in Moscow. It drove the Soviet Union's own crash program to develop the weapon, which they did in 1949. This marked the true beginning of the Cold War. It was not a war of armies clashing on battlefields. It was a war of ideology, of espionage, of technological competition, and of constant simmering tension, all conducted under the shadow of the mushroom cloud. The world was divided into two camps, and for nearly half a century, the two superpowers engaged in a global struggle for influence. It fueled the arms race, the space race, and numerous proxy wars across the globe. The Manhattan Project gave the United States an unprecedented military advantage, but it was a temporary one. The real lasting effect was to create a new form of terror that would shape global politics for the rest of the 20th century. The peace that followed World War II was not a true peace. It was a cold peace, maintained by a delicate balance of terror. Every major international crisis, from the Berlin blockade to the Cuban Missile Crisis, carried the risk of escalating into a full-scale nuclear exchange that could end human civilization. The project's success in ending one hot war directly led to the beginning of a long cold one, the legacy of which still shapes our world today in the form of thousands of nuclear weapons that remain on high alert. Did the use of the atomic devices truly shorten the war? Or would it have ended soon anyway, as some historians now argue? Could a different approach, like a demonstration of the weapon on an uninhabited island have achieved the same result without the same human cost? And ultimately, did the creation of a weapon so powerful that it could never be used actually make the world a safer place by making large-scale wars between great powers too dangerous to contemplate?